Major LaMonica is going to start us off by giving us a brief overview of some of the highlights in his paper.
All right. Can we show the first slide, please? The best way to start this off is actually kind of start off with a brief anecdote in order to explain kind of the importance and provide a little bit of the background on some of this research. So October of Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You can see here on the slide, we've got a map of the Cuban Missile Crisis showing the island of Cuba and the quarantine line. The Cuban Missile Crisis is usually held up as an example of a time when deterrence was highly successful. But one of the things that I'm going to kind of show here is that occasionally that's not entirely true. So you can see here on the map, you've got Cuba, you've got the quarantine line there. On 27 October 1962, the U.S. forces manning that quarantine line detected a Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel submarine, designation B-59. That submarine was traveling towards the quarantine line, was traveling underwater, and didn't appear to have any intentions of stopping. So the U.S. quarantine forces, they followed the sub, and they attempted their standard procedures in order to force it to surface. Consisted of dropping some practice depth charges, dropping hand grenades over the side in order to signal to the sub that it needed to surface without directly damaging it. Once the sub did that, it did surface, but it kept traveling towards the quarantine line. Go ahead and next slide, please. They attempted to get it to halt its course or change its course by strafing the water near it, firing shots ahead of it. Again, these are, at the time, they were considered to be standard naval tactics for persuading a ship to stop without directly damaging it. They followed it for several days. Eventually, the sub surfaced, and the U.S. Navy lost it, but it turned away from the quarantine line. So they at the time considered that to be a success, and it went virtually without note during the time, just as, hey, this was a submarine that was stopped. From the Soviet point of view, those actions were significantly different because, next slide, please. Unbeknownst to the U.S. Navy, submarine B-59 and several of the others in its squadron were actually carrying 15 kiloton nuclear tipped torpedoes. These torpedoes had been loaded onto the subs with the highest levels of secrecy. At the time the sub was stopped by the U.S. Navy, or they attempted to stop it, the captain of that sub was actually considering using the 15 kiloton weapon against the ships that were attempting to stop the sub. And only by the actions of a member of the Admiralty staff on board the sub was able to persuade the captain to not employ that weapon. So here we have an instance in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which usually held up as one of the premier deterrence events, where a Soviet vessel had a deterrent, these torpedoes on board, and yet they were completely ineffective at preventing the submarine from being attacked. And they were almost ineffective at preventing nuclear engagement from starting right there. Again, that was only due to the member of the Admiralty staff on board the sub. So the question starts to rise up, okay, well, then why didn't the deterrent work? Why wasn't the deterrent effective in this instance? And the answer boils down to, well, secrecy, which is usually held up as one of the key components of our nuclear policy. All right, stop screen sharing, please. So the question that I approached when I began my research was, how does the secrecy of a deterrent impact its effectiveness in deterrence? In other words, how secret does something need to be in order to make it effective as a deterrent? This is something that it's been looked into before. Several others have done research on this. The predominance of the research seemed to be in game theory. Some aspects of game theory said that the open flow of information ensures the best deterrence, that there should be as little secrecy as possible so that all actors understand what's going on. Other aspects of, or other game theory researchers have found that a moderate level of secrecy or providing some ambiguity actually created the best deterrence. But I didn't find a whole lot of historical case studies to back this up. So I decided to dig into that a little bit. I took a look at several cases of historical deterrence, several case studies, and I ranked those based on how effective I believe deterrence had been in that situation, and also what the level of secrecy was for the given deterrent capability. The examples I used, if you go into my paper, you can actually read them in depth, but just to summarize here, I covered the Cuban Missile Crisis in a couple different aspects, both the Soviet submarine we talked about here and some ballistic missiles stationed in Cuba. I went over the Yom Kippur War with Israel, North Korea's current stance, Desert Storm and the effectiveness of Iraq's deterrent capability, as well as the Maginot Line that the French built during World War II. What I found was that the historical cases showed that neither full secrecy nor full transparency was the best when attempting to deter an adversary. It seemed that the most successful cases of deterrence were, and for some of the ones that were ongoing currently are, those cases that involve partial secrecy, where some of the information is presented to an adversary enough to show them that a deterrent capability is present and that it is credible, but not enough information is provided that would allow an adversary to mitigate or to circumvent the deterrent capability. This seems to be backed up, going back to the example we talked about previously, with the Soviet B-59 incident. The submarine was carrying a deterrent, but it was a complete secret from the Navy. The Navy had no clue it was there, and as a result, they were not deterred by it in the slightest. And so the deterrent effectiveness of that nuclear torpedo was effectively nothing. On the flip side, you also don't necessarily want to have a complete openness when you're dealing with the deterrent situation as well. The example that I best found that applied to this one was actually the Maginot Line that the French built, and then looking at how that was effective during World War II. The French built this deterrent capability to deter the Germans from attacking them. Unfortunately, because its locations and all of its characteristics were widely known and available, the Germans were able to come up with a workaround where they simply literally went around the deterrent capability. And as a result, it again was not effective in trying to deter them. So partial secrecy, where you inform an adversary that a deterrent exists, that it's credible, but you still hide enough of its characteristics, that seem to be the most successful. All right. Could you please show the next slide, please? So these slides that are going to come up, these show the rankings of the different cases that I had. First, in kind of a tabulated form, where you can see the different cases and how I ranked each of them in terms of both secrecy and deterrence. There we go. You can see I've got all the cases I talked about there previously, as well as a Pakistani ballistic missile system. And again, what we see in this is you see that secrecy, which starts very low at the top and goes to very high at the bottom, you see that the deterrent capability kind of spikes, becomes the most effective right there in the middle, and that it seems to be less effective both on the low end of secrecy and on the high end of secrecy. Next slide. In more visual graph form, you can see it here, where once again, as secrecy progresses from complete transparency to complete secrecy, the optimal level for deterring an adversary, and I stress that a little bit, is right there in the middle. Okay, stop screen sharing, please. So what are the implications of all this? Why should we care? Well, first of all, the Air Force and most U.S. defense agencies and entities tend to default, especially in instances of nuclear deterrence, to more secret seems to be best. Where when we're not sure whether or not something should be secret, we just default to, well, let's just make it secret, and then we can kind of figure that out later. But based on my research, or at least what that seemed to show, is that as long as you're attempting deterrence, that can't necessarily be an automatic solution. because if you want to avoid conflicts, you can't just keep making all of your deterrent capabilities secret. They're only effective at deterring if the adversary knows they're there and knows that they're credible. And so what we really need to do is we need to critically assess the characteristics which must remain hidden and the characteristics which should remain visible of any given deterrent capability that we have or are developing, and that it needs to be reassessed as time goes on. Now, one thing that was important to note in the research is that my research really didn't take into account the combat effectiveness and secrecy's impact on combat effectiveness. And I know that that's a counterpoint to why something should remain secret or why a deterrent capability or a weapon system should remain secret. My research and my case studies were focused on deterrence capability. In other words, do you want to use a deterrent to avoid a war, as opposed to combat effectiveness? Do you want to use a weapon system to win a war? And what you can kind of see on there a little bit is that whereas deterrence seems to say that a moderate level of secrecy is the optimum solution, other uses may have different levels of secrecy that would be the most effective. Additionally, different adversaries may have different levels of secrecy that are most effective against them. Looking at the example of the Iraqi air defense system during the Gulf War, the Iraqis developed this system, and because it was developed by outside parties, information about it seemed to be more or less widely available. That system was designed in part to deter regional threats, so Iran, other state actors from attacking Iraq. And in that respect, against those adversaries, it may have been successful. Unfortunately, against the United States, who had the capability to develop the workarounds and develop the ability to circumvent the Iraqi air defense system, it was not effective. So the second thing that this research does show is that if you want to try to deter multiple adversaries in multiple different situations, and you want to be able to both prevent wars and win wars, then you would actually probably want to have multiple deterrent capabilities with multiple levels of secrecy. This, in terms of direct implications, this serves to somewhat bolster the argument for the United States having, for example, a nuclear triad, because I can have one deterrent capability, say ICBMs, that are more or less broadly visible, that all their locations are known, they're widely available, but which can stand and be, again, very visible against adversaries that can't circumvent it. At the same time, we have additional capabilities, say the bombers and the submarines, which are more secret in varying different levels, and which can provide deterrence against those adversaries that could potentially circumvent our ICBM capabilities, because they may not have the information they would need to circumvent the bombers or the submarines. So, to summarize the research real briefly, deterrence seems to be the most effective when the secrecy of the deterrent capabilities is not complete, nor is it completely transparent. That there's a moderate level of secrecy tailored to the individual adversaries and tailored to the situations at hand. And really the Air Force and the DoD need to make a deliberate effort in terms of assessing the level of secrecy that they want for all of their deterrent capabilities, both as they're developed and as time goes on, and reassessing them to make sure that they're still doing what they need to do and what we want them to do. Dr. Bolfeld, back over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So now Dr. Lorenzo and I will provide some short commentary on Major LaMonica's piece, and then we will open it up for questions. When I read, so I'll begin. When I read Major LaMonica's paper, it reminded me of Dr. Strangelove, the movie. And in particular, it reminded me of the moment in the movie. Fair warning, I'm going to do some spoilers here. It reminded me of the moment in the movie when the Soviet Union says, well, we know that you didn't intend to send out the bombers, and we know at this point that they're not that you can't recall them, but you can't. We can't just let the nuclear detonation go, because we've developed a doomsday machine. And if you start a nuclear war against us, the doomsday machine automatically goes off and it will destroy the entire world. And at this point, right, the Americans are like, but why? Why would you create something like this? And they said, well, to make sure that we never went to nuclear war. The Americans are like, but you didn't tell us, right? That's a problem. You didn't tell us that you had created this machine that was going to destroy the world. We didn't know. If we didn't know, how could we be deterred from starting a nuclear war? And really, I think that illustrates what Major LaMonica is pointing out in his paper. Secrecy is a way that we try to control the deterrence game. But the problem is that if misused, it can have pretty intense consequences. So his paper really does an excellent job on zeroing in on perception and the ways that we try and manipulate deterrence, secrecy being a very important one. And this takes me into Schelling and his monumental book, Arms and Influence. And Schelling writes in there that deterrence is often viewed as responses to yes/no questions. And I think when we think about deterrence, we often think about it this way, right? Like, I am going to credibly commit to an action if you do this, and then the target gets to say, yes, I'm going to do this and risk that you are going to follow through, or no, I'm not going to, and I'm going to be deterred. But Schelling writes that in reality, war is a process, right? It is not a yes/no question. And I think that it's in this moment that Major LaMonica's paper really makes a contribution, because when you consider war as a process, the question of perceptions and the question of secrecy become far more important. So to put it in a little bit different context, his paper nicely highlights the need to use secrecy not as a winning chess strategy, but as a tool to create a shared risk between the participants, right? So what he is arguing for, or at least the way I see his argument, in terms of that moderate level of secrecy being the most ideal, is that you're trying to control your known unknowns, right? There are things that the adversary knows that they don't know. And that shared risk, that unknown is, and that level of secrecy that creates that unknown, you know that you don't know it, is really what makes deterrence work effectively. So I thought that it did a really nice job of pointing that out. Okay, I will hand it over to Dr. Lorenzo for his commentary.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can follow up Dr. Strangelove, but I'll try. Oh, okay, so what I want to do is to continue talking about the larger implications of Major LaMonica's work, which I agree really highlights the importance of thinking about both secrecy and disclosure. So what Major LaMonica does is provide us with an important analysis that alludes to strategic reasons for disclosing information about deterrence capabilities and tactical reasons for concealing information about the weapon systems that constitute that capability. So how do we incorporate this understanding within a larger understanding of deterrence? So one way is to put this analysis alongside some strategic reasons for concealing information about deterrence capabilities. And what this does is bring us to the concept of security dilemmas. So the understanding that attempts to increase security, as deterrence attempts to do, can provoke actions by others that actually decrease your security. So again, to reiterate something that Major LaMonica said, if you're thinking about the disclosure of information in the context of deterrence, states want a rival to have various kinds of information. You want to disclose deterrence capabilities, you want to demonstrate that those capabilities actually work, and you want to demonstrate a willingness to use those capabilities, right? So credibility. So this last point I think is the most important because it involves perceptions. How is the other party interpreting the information that's disclosed? So in particular, we're interested in how other states can interpret these disclosures in ways that lead to actions that might erode rather than enhance security. So for example, disclosure of a deterrence capability can be interpreted as offensive in nature rather than purely defensive in nature. thus spurring a preemptive attack. Even if the disclosure is understood to be defensive, we have to remember that security is a zero-sum commodity among rivals. And so increased security for me by creating a deterrent capability means decreased security for you. So the disclosure of a deterrent capability can result in another actor enhancing their offensive and defensive capabilities in general, not even just in terms of the weapon system, but just in general. So there are various kinds of perceptions, therefore, that may lead to the disclosure of deterrence actually sparking an unwanted reaction rather than the wanted reaction. So again, this leads to important strategic reasons why an actor may want to conceal information about a deterrence capability or to leave its status ambiguous. Most importantly, to avoid an attack by a rival who feels threatened by that disclosure. And it can also, though I won't get into this, it can actually also spark an arms race, which you might not want to get into. So just to talk about some contemporary examples of deterrence disclosures and possible attacks. If we look at North Korea in the early 1990s, that regime gave indications it was embarking on a nuclear weapons program as a deterrent and possibly to gain concessions. But it already had a significant conventional deterrent. So this disclosure was interpreted as an offensive threat rather than a defensive measure. Consequently, the Clinton administration in the US almost attacked North Korea. If the agreed framework had not been produced, in all likelihood, North Korea would have been attacked. So this attempt to deter actually decreased North Korean security. In another example that's somewhat different, Saddam Hussein hints in the late 1990s that he has WMD programs in order to deter internal and external enemies. So on the one hand, he's telling his neighbors, yes, I have WMD programs, again, as a measure of deterrence, but he's telling the UN and the US that he doesn't as a way of escaping sanctions. So the problem is he's not able to segregate these audiences, right? And we know what the result is. The result is the Second Gulf War and his regime is overthrown. So looking at some of these examples, what might you conclude? Again, Major Lubotica provides us with important new understanding of disclosures and concealment that should be incorporated in larger understandings of deterrence. We should place this analysis alongside existing understandings as new reasons for thinking through what types of deterrent information should be disclosed and which concealed in various kinds of situations. So I would argue that what this does, in addition to what Major Lubotica talks about in terms of different contexts, different weapon systems, different rivals that need to be deterred, is that it reinforces the necessity of thinking about trade-offs regarding disclosures. That a disclosure may not just be a matter of absolute judgment, but a matter of very considered judgment, weighing the pluses and minuses given particular kinds of situations with regard to whether you disclose or don't disclose a particular deterrent. So I'll turn it back now to Major Lubotica.
All right. I don't believe that I had a whole lot else in terms of response. At this time, if folks have questions, I believe we've got the chat open, so you can post your questions there in the chat, and we will address those as they come in. Dr. Balfeld.
All right, so our first question is from Bill Murphy, and he asks, how can the US better use secrecy or not use secrecy to deter countries such as China, North Korea, or other rogue states, great powers, maybe our P5+1 setup, great China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations. Don't want to use acronyms that are not common parlance. And then part 2 is, what are your thoughts on deterring a country that relies on secrecy, ambiguity, and or lack of transparency? For example, China's stratagems such as conceal your dispositions and your condition will remain secret, which leads to victory, and deng dictatum, hide your ambitions and disguise your claws.
Sir, thank you for the question. My initial response to that is, and I'll confess here to having somewhat of a realist approach, where Chinese part of the issue and part of the difficulty of dealing with Chinese strategy in that way is that you have to kind of assume that they might be doing what is exactly described there, concealing their dispositions, concealing their intentions. We can't necessarily know with certainty or believe with certainty that we know what China is intending to do. And so as a result, I think that about the best we can do is, again, kind of develop those multiple deterrent capabilities to sort of deal with the multiple potential strategies that the Chinese could be taking. So on one hand, you would definitely want to have a capability which is going to be broadly visible, which we can then use to present openly to the Chinese and say, hey, this is a big deterrent capability. It is going to be extremely difficult for you to overcome, and it would take a lot of resources for you to do so, and there would be a huge trade-off in terms of damage if you were to attempt to overcome this deterrent capability. But here it is, and we can present that. And so if they would be dissuaded by that, we would have an option to dissuade them in that way. At the same time, we need to make a very deliberate effort to have a much more concealed option. Say, as we have it now with the submarines, or even more concealed deterrent capabilities, where we can basically say, hey, we have an additional deterrent capability. We are not going to present you with a lot of information about it. We're not going to tell you how big it is or where it's located, but just know that we have it, and know that you don't know where it is or what exactly it's doing. In case that would be the thing that would dissuade them. And then hopefully having something in the middle, like the bombers, or potentially another system that could be tailored to other adversaries, perhaps ones that might not believe we would use a large-scale system against them, or that we would compromise our secret system. So this is kind of where North Korea would come into play. Whereas North Korea might believe that we would withhold use of our ICBMs in a deterrence capability because we would want to be holding that for use against China. And we wouldn't want to compromise the use of our submarines because, again, that's another bolstering capability against China. We could still have something like the nuclear bombers there, which could provide sort of a moderate level where we could say, okay, well, yeah, we have a different, more flexible capability here. And this one provides some alternative means, some alternative capabilities, and we can tailor that a little bit differently against the different adversaries. So, sir, I hope that answers your question.
All right. I thought you made some good points, particularly with your touching on tailored deterrence. So making sure that we match our deterrent posture and capabilities to a particular actor. Because as you note in your paper, all perceptions are dependent on the receiver. All right. Second question is from Gary Emerson. And it is similar to how we let everyone know we had nukes during the Cold War. Should the US military or NSA or CIA let it be known some of our cyber capability to further deter cyber attacks on the United States?
So I will acknowledge right at the very start here that I am not an expert in cyber warfare. I have some basic knowledge, of what those capabilities are and how they work, but not in-depth understanding of them or in-depth practice with them as, say, a cyber operator would. That said, there are some aspects of cyber operations that would need to be taken into account here. One is the fact that perhaps more so than, say, a deterrent like nuclear weapons, cyber capabilities, if you know about them, they are much more vulnerable to then being circumvented. That said, based on the research that I did, based on how the case studies seem to turn out, I would say, yes, we should let some of our cyber capabilities be known. And I have to put a huge stress on the some there, that it would be beneficial to deterring some of our adversaries if we let it be known that we have the capability to respond, and that we can respond and inflict some costs that they would probably consider to be unacceptable. That said, we would have to be very careful on how we would do so, because you would want to reveal some of your capabilities, but you wouldn't want to reveal all the characteristics about those. Furthermore, you would again have to take into account those adversaries that have different capabilities, for whom just the acknowledgement that we have it would be enough for them to figure out a workaround. So you would have to keep some of our cyber capabilities completely secret. And then you'd have to keep some with differing levels of secrecy in order to most effectively tailor that deterrent capability there. I will turn it over to Dr. Bolfeld or Dr. Lorenzo if you guys have any other comments.
So interesting thoughts about revealing some cyber capabilities. Cyber, I think, is one of the areas where it is easier to delineate between offensive and defensive operations. The difference between a firewall, a defensive cyber operation, and hacking, a offensive cyber operation. So if we delineate those, just really basically, right, like not in any level of detail there, it's fascinating to think about how those might apply to deterrence, right? So if we're thinking about deterring a cyber attack, perhaps revealing more of what our defensive cyber operations are in the broad terms might be more effective than an offensive, revealing an offensive capability. Simply because defense, if we're trying to prevent a cyber attack, we want to show that we have the ability to repel it, versus if our strategy is to retaliate. And I think generally speaking, we would prefer to defend and repel an attack than we would to have to retaliate, because in order to conduct an offensive cyber operation, you have to be able to make use of, for example, a 0 day, which reveals a weakness in an operating system that was beforehand publicly unknown, right? So you found a chink in the armor and you want to exploit that. Well, once you exploit that, it gives the adversary a chance to patch up that chink and you can't use it again. So revealing our our offensive cyber operation openings means that we've used the capability, we can't use it again. So just to add on to what you were saying, Major LaMonica, I think that if we were to reveal some of our capabilities, revealing them on the defensive side would be the most helpful. What do you think? Do you agree?
I do agree. I think that defensively, revealing not necessarily even the capabilities, but some of the efforts that we're taking towards cyber defense, and maybe publicizing those a little bit more. Emphasizing the capability or the resources or the effort that we're putting into cyber defense across the nation may be more beneficial. Dr. Lorenzo, I saw that you had some commentary there.
Yeah, I would just like to add that cyber seems to require much more agility and a much quicker generation of both offensive and defensive capabilities. You could have ICBM missiles that are in the ground for 20 years and they're still, as effective as they were previously. You have an offensive or defensive cyber capability now, and 2 weeks from now, neither one of them may be any good. So both a continuous turnover seems to me to be important, and if that's the case, then it may not be as damaging to reveal either offensive or defensive capability today, given that everybody knows it's going to be completely different tomorrow. So that might be a factor that makes cyber perhaps somewhat different from nuclear and other kinds of military weapons. That would just be my speculation. I know very little about cyber, but that seems to me to be the case, that it's a much more fluid realm of activity than our conventional or nuclear weapon system.
One other thing that I will note with regard to cyber is that actually touching on what Dr. Lorenzo said, part of the reason why I think it's more fluid is that there are so many more players in the realm than there are in some of the deterrent capabilities that we've discussed previously. I mean, in terms of nuclear weapons, you basically have to be a nation state in order to build a nuclear weapon, and a sufficiently advanced one at that. Even in terms of conventional military capabilities, you have to have the vast industrial capability in order to produce that, in order to make a big impact on it. In terms of cyber, I mean, you've got small companies, you have individuals, and it's the number of players, the number of actors is just vastly increased. And so that does create a much more fluid environment, much more different levels of effectiveness and different levels of adversary capability as well. So I guess the short answer is it's a little more complicated.
I think it also invites a whole of government response as well. So this morning on the news, they were reporting that they had recovered a significant amount of the money that had been paid in ransom for the pipeline shutdown in the United States. And that had been headed up by the Justice Department. And I thought that was really an interesting play out of events, right? We have a cyber attack, the ransom is paid, and yet we were able to go and then recover the money that had been paid. So, we have that clap back, not by a particular company or by, the company that had been targeted, or by the US military, but by another arm of the US government. So it brings in the idea that not only is cyber and cyber deterrence far more fluid, but that we can have other elements of our government participating in how we craft our deterrent message, right? Because ransomware in the United States, maybe it's not so profitable anymore if we can get the money back. So a really interesting case playing out in that realm today. All right, so we have about 5 more minutes remaining. So if anyone has questions, please put them into the chat. But seeing none at the moment, do either of my panelists have any concluding or final thoughts that they would like to share?
I think I've really kind of said my piece and done quite a bit of talking over the course of this panel. So Dr. Lorenzo, if you have anything else that you'd like to conclude with.
I would just like to say it's a very interesting piece of research. It's something that I hope you follow up on in the future if this is something that you're interested in. And in particular, thinking about it in terms of case studies. You really didn't have a whole lot of space to explore those in depth And I think once you do that, it will reveal even more interesting aspects of each one of those and lead to even more interesting understandings of the needs for both disclosure and secrecy.
I agree. I thought the paper was fascinating. I think you made a really valuable contribution to our understanding of secrecy in deterrence in identifying that a medium level of secrecy is an ideal point. And it's going to be very interesting to think about how this applies to policy, right? So how can policymakers take what you have learned through your case studies and figure out how to craft that right level of secrecy in our deterrent messaging? And who's going to do that messaging? I think that that is going to be a really interesting challenge, particularly as we move back towards great power competition, but we still have the lower level rogue states who are presenting nuclear challenges and deterrence challenges to the United States going forward. And then I think the other interesting thing that came up today in our discussion was, Dr. Lorenzo, your comment on how other countries message us and the revealing or keeping of secrets in terms of their own capabilities, with your North Korea example. And so remembering that it's not, deterrence is not just about us messaging everybody else, but how everybody else is messaging us as well. And thinking about, what is it that they are actually trying to tell us? Are they trying to tell us something for offensive purposes? Are they trying to tell us something for defensive purposes? And why are they keeping something secret? Why are they revealing some things? And why are they doing it when they do it? So I think that the paper, while focused on the US and US messaging, has some really interesting implications once we flip that around and we think about how other countries are messaging us. And that brings us to the end of our panel time for today. I want to thank all of the participants for coming and asking your questions. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for providing some really great discussion and commentary this morning.
It was great to be here from Taipei, halfway across the world. So it was really good to join both of you. I know, Major, you're in a hotel room, so good travels, and I will see you all at some point in the future.
All right. Well, thank you to both my fellow panelists, and thank everyone else who came out to take a look at this and listen into some of this. I will say a bit of, I guess, self-promotion, that the paper was actually linked in the chat, and I believe it's also accessible on the AU Research Showcase website. So if you'd like to take a longer read, then it's available there. Otherwise, thank you everyone for coming out, and have a good day.